Hello, everyone, and welcome to BrainMap. As you all know, BrainMap is co-sponsored by the P41 funded Center for Mesoscale Mapping housed at Martinos. We're very grateful for that. And thank you, everyone, for being here, our audience on Zoom and people in the room. So without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, Professor Fedorenko. Dr. Fedorenko is a cognitive neuroscientist who studies the human language system and its relationship with other systems in the brain. She received her bachelor's degree from Harvard University in 2002 and her PhD from MIT in 2007. She was then awarded a K99 ROO Pathway to Independence Career Development Award from NIH. In 2014, she joined the faculty at MGH-HMS, and in 2019, she returned to MIT, where she is currently an associate professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences and a member of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research. Fedorenko uses fMRI, intracranial recordings, and stimulation, EEG, MEG, and computational modeling to study language and cognition in adults and children, including individuals with developmental and acquired brain disorders and individuals with structurally atypical brains, but typical like cognition. So without any further ado, thank you so much, Ev, for coming here to give us a lecture, and I'll just pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks for having me. Hi to people online. Okay, see if my clicker is working here. Okay, so I think I last spoke in this series about 3 years and a half ago, and it's always a pleasure to be back. As Abbas mentioned, MGH was my first home as a faculty member, and I'm forever grateful to people like Randy Buckner and Bruce Fischel and others who have welcomed me here and made my early faculty career, gave it a good start. So if you were at my last talk here 3.5 years ago, you will have heard some of these things. This is kind of a synthesis of big findings from work we've done over the last 15 years or so, but there's a lot of recent findings sprinkled throughout from just the last couple of years. All right. So can you guys hear me okay? Is this working? I can move a little bit closer this way.
Can you project a little bit? Sorry.
A little bit closer. Yep.
Yes.
Is this okay? So I'm going to focus on 3 big lines of work. So I can't touch on some things that we've worked on, but I chose to focus on the things that I think have been most impactful and or maybe of broadest interest. So I'm going to talk about how language relates to other capacities. I'm going to zoom in into the language system and talk about its internal structure and the kinds of computations that this language system supports. And then I'll talk about this very exciting recent line of work where we're using computational models, neural network language models as models of human language processing. Before I do that, I'm just going to say a few words about the methodological foundation of this research enterprise, and then just very briefly introduce this protagonist of the talk, which is the language network. Okay, so when I started working on the language systems, this was about 2006, I wanted to make sure that I could refer to the same functional areas across different individuals and across studies. There were many, many questions I wanted to ask about the system, and I wanted to have the confidence to be able to talk about the same brain regions. And of course, my vision was that eventually we can adopt the same way of defining these regions across labs for a true collaborative research enterprise. And that's kind of been happening, which is really great. So I began by developing a so-called localizer paradigm that could be used to find language areas quickly and reliably in just a few minutes of scanning. I used the contrast between people reading or listening to sentences and a control condition, which is perceptually similar to language, but doesn't have meaning and structure. So listening to speech played backwards or speech in a language you don't understand, or reading a sequence of non-words, things like that. All of those contrasts elicit very reliable, very consistent activity. Here, the language systems in 5 sample individuals. As you can see, the general topography is similar, but the precise location, shapes, and sizes of these regions vary quite a lot. And I know that a lot of people here at MGH are very highly aware of this kind of variability. Although importantly, this topography is highly stable within an individual over time. So here are maps from 2 participants across 3 time points each, including over a span of a few years. And I hope you can appreciate the similarity of the maps within each row. But because of this topographic variability across participants, I spent a lot of time and mental effort arguing that it's really important to identify these regions and individuals, because traditional methods where you average maps together in a common space will blur a lot of relevant structure out. So for example, in cases where you have nearby functionally distinct areas and you average things, you often actually end up with fundamentally wrong conclusions about the underlying structure. Okay. Two more quick things on methods. Most of the work I'll talk about today has been done in English, but we've now developed and released these localizers for many diverse languages, over 50 languages now, which is still a very small fraction of the 7,000 languages that are signed and spoken across the world, but it's better than nothing. So we're trying to both increase the generalizability of our findings. English is a very weird language in many ways. Like if you look at it relative to the 7,000 languages in the world, it's actually very atypical in its properties. And also there's some phenomena that you just can't study in English, and it would be really nice to have the arsenal of more diverse languages at our disposal. They're just maps of speakers of 6 different languages, just to show again that they're broadly similar. There's some differences, but the differences that you see between languages in these maps are comparable to the variability we see among the speakers within a language. At least so far, we haven't seen any systematic differences between languages. And second, because functional localization may not always be possible. For example, if you're working with postmortem brains and doing some cellular genetic analysis on the cells, we've also created this probabilistic language atlas based on over 800 people who scan on this paradigm over the last bunch of years. And this atlas can be used to estimate a location in some template space, like the MNI space or the free surfer FS average space, the probability that it falls within the language system. We're trying to create this kind of universal frame of reference for the system. Okay, so a few words about what the system is about. So now I'm just schematically showing these regions in red, but these red masks represent no problem, where individual activations will land. But as you saw in individual maps, in any given person, it's just a small fraction of these regions. This is just a schematic illustration of kind of broad areas where we see activity for the system. Okay, so this system is active both when we understand language, and no matter whether it's spoken language or written language or sign language, as well as when we produce language, again, by speaking, writing, or signing. And together, these properties suggest that the system is a likely place where we store our language knowledge. So I think of the system as an encoder-decoder system. Oh, sorry. And what do I mean by our knowledge of language? Well, it's basically we know what words mean and how to put them together. That's roughly what we know when we know a language. And we can use this set of representations, knowledge representations, to both take a thought and encode it into a word sequence, or take a word sequence that somebody else produced and decode a complex meaning representation, right? These properties also make it clear that the system is distinct from lower level speech perceptual and speech articulation systems. So the classic, oh, thank you so much. So the classic Broca's and Wernicke's areas are actually not a part of the system. Broca's area is a lower level motor planning area, which receives input from the system during language production. And Wernicke's area, oh, I'm talking about them as they were originally discovered by Broca and Wernicke, not the kind of monstrosities they've become from misuse of those terms in the literature. So Wernicke's area is a lower level speech perceptual area that provides input to this higher level, more abstract language system during comprehension. The regions of the system the regions of this network form a very, very functionally integrated system with a high degree of synchronized activity. In fact, you can find this network simply from patterns of bold signal fluctuations. So this is work from Rod Braga and Randy Buckner and colleagues. I'm showing you 3 sample brains. For each brains, there's 2 kinds of data shown. I'm just going to zoom in on one of those to make it easier to see. So in black are outlines of this network as defined from intrinsic bold signal fluctuations. So this is everybody familiar with what I'm talking about when I'm talking about, right? So just throwing a clustering algorithms on a bunch of voxels measured during so-called naturalistic states. And in colors are activations for the kind of contrast I was talking to you about. And you can see that there's really an amazingly tight correspondence. And if we examine the time courses of these 5 kind of core regions in the system while participants listen to some linguistic stimulus, like a naturalistic story, the correlations are in the 0.6, 0.7 range. So you can predict a lot from what one region is doing while processing language from another region's activity. Second, we'll see those here. Okay, so the language network also responds to language in different contexts. So it doesn't really matter what you're doing with language. You can be passively listening. You can be listening and answering comprehension questions. Basically, whenever interpretable linguistic input is present or is being generated, the system is engaged. The language system, as I already alluded to, is similar in its topography and properties across diverse languages. I mentioned this as a fact about speakers of different languages, but this also holds within bilingual and multilingual speakers. So who here speaks another language other than English? Yeah, okay, most of you. So for all of you guys who raise your hands, you have multiple sets of knowledge representations living in your brain, right? And you can use them depending on different contexts. So here, the columns are for individual speakers, and you can see the corresponding activations for their different languages, like somebody who's second language is Japanese and third language is French, and so on. All of the languages, and we've done this in polyglots up to 10 or 20 languages, they all end up in the system. So this kind of, some of these older findings where newer learned languages end up in a different place in the brain don't seem to hold up with scrutiny. And as you can see from the last column, the language doesn't need to be a natural language. So languages that are created artificially for whatever reason, like Esperanto or Klingon, which is created as a language to create like an identity for a fictional species, they all load on the system as well. So this is, we have a paper on bioarchive. So we've done this across 5 different conlangths. Esperanto is like easiest to find speakers of, but you can find people who spend their free time speaking Dothraki because they're fans of Games of Thrones and so on. So it doesn't look like the language needs to have existed for many centuries, having been shaped by the kinds of pressures that exist on learning a language as a native language to engage this system. Developmentally, the system is present and shows adult-like topography by about age 3 or 4. Although how it comes to be, we don't know, because it's challenging to study brains post-infancy, right? So you can study infants, which is also challenging, but infants don't really do much. They can just fall asleep, and you can study auditory responses. But they don't, of course, an infant doesn't have language when they're born, right? They have to learn it by virtue of being exposed to language. And between about age 6 months and 3 years of age is a very, very challenging period to test people, although we have a postdoc who is currently trying to scan toddlers. But by the time we can measure it reliably by like 3 years of age, the system is there and looks adult-like. And finally, these are the regions that whose damage in adulthood will lead to linguistic deficits. So these regions are causally important for language. So this was just like a breeze through some of the key things. If you wanted to learn more, which just a review just came out earlier this year, which kind of synthesizes a lot of this and elaborates on these various points. Okay, so on to this first line of work on the relationship between language and other things. So many animals, including humans, do 3 kinds of things in the world. We perceive the world through our various senses. We acquire knowledge of the world, and using this knowledge, we can make inferences and make predictions. And we physically interact with the world and with our conspecifics. So where does language fit into this tripartite structure? Well, there has been controversies about the relationship between language and each of those 3 buckets, but of course, the most controversial has been the relationship between language and cognition, or language and thinking. And this relationship was actually what drew me to neuroscience, because for many centuries, philosophers, linguists, evolutionary biologists, and so on have pondered these big questions, right? Like, are language and thought kind of the same thing? Do they rely on the same mechanisms? Is thought even possible without language? Why did language emerge in our species? And is it language that made us smart and such a successful species? And I don't mind pondering things, but I like it when we can get some empirical traction on these questions. And neuroscience actually provides us tools to do so. You can try to address some of these questions behaviorally, but it's challenging and less direct. And without empirical data, and in some cases in spite of it, people have offered strong opinions on these questions, arguing that language and thought are really the same, and you can't think without language. Here are just some quotes, just so it's not like imaginary straw man. There's actual, well-known people who have argued, for example, this is a quote from Chomsky, that the systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing actions, and other mental acts. And then on the second question, he offers this opinion: a substantial part of what we call thinking is simply linguistic manipulation. So if there is a severe deficit of language, there will be a severe deficit of thought. And I'm going to argue that empirically those answers are not right. So before talking about the relationship between language and thought, I'll say just briefly what I mean by thought, because thought is a big construct. And of course, it's not unidimensional. I would say that broadly, thought encompasses our knowledge of the world and our ability to reason over those knowledge representations and predictions. And we can talk about kind of our general world knowledge, sometimes called common sense knowledge, common sense reasoning, as well as domains like our knowledge of the physical objects and how they interact, or social agents and how they conceive of the world. Reasoning can also be domain general, abstracted away from particular knowledge bases. This kind of reasoning is often linked to this notion of general fluid intelligence. And also the host of executive abilities like working memory and cognitive control are lumped into that bucket. In some human cultures, people also develop formal reasoning skills, including math and logic, but these are not culturally universal. So how does the language system relate to all these other abilities? So there's basically two methods that have existed. One has existed for a while, one is more recent. One is patient investigations and one is brain imaging. So I'll start with showing you some brain imaging data. So over the last 10, 15 years, we've tested for overlap between language processing and many different perceptual, motor, and cognitive abilities. I'm just combining data in one graph. This is over 30 different experiments, but all of the experiments are structured in the same way. So you come into the lab, I find your language regions with my 5-minute long language localizer, and then I ask, how do these language regions respond when you're doing some non-linguistic task, including these various thinking tests, like when you're solving a math problem, or when I'm asking you to reason about somebody else's mental state, or I'm asking you to think about some navigational problems and so on. And in gray bars are responses to 3 different language tasks. So it's a sentence listening, sentence reading, and sentence generation. In this case, it's describing pictures. And in different colors are responses to these different non-linguistic conditions. And as you can see, the highest bars are still, the language bars are about twice higher than this. And this degree of selectivity is comparable to what you find, for example, in the fusiform face area, where the response to face is about twice higher than response to non-face objects. So these are very strongly selective regions that are really not engaged during many, many, many different kinds of non-linguistic tasks and inputs. And of course, I should say that and 0 is fixation, low-level fixation. And all of these non-linguistic conditions elicit some strong responses elsewhere in the brain, right? So it's not like they're bad tasks. They just happen to engage regions that are mostly non-overlapping with these language areas. Okay. Oh, and critically to the language thought questions, these areas don't show much response when we engage in thinking and reasoning. I'm highlighting just a few domains here. And we haven't stopped. We keep trying to find tasks that may engage this language system, because whenever you say that the language system is not needed for thinking, somebody will always say, well, you haven't tested all of the tasks, to which I say, please give me them. Tell me which tasks we should test. Like if you have a hypothesis, saying that, yeah, you haven't shown conclusively that no task will ever engage the system is okay. I just don't think it's very productive. But if you give me some good ideas for things that you think for some reason are more likely to engage these areas, we'll certainly test them.
What is on the x-axis before you move on? The differences between the different bars.
The difference I'm highlighting is between each of these bars and these language tasks. These are just 79 different conditions from across over 30 experiments.
So each one of those bars is a different condition of study?
Correct.
So like when you're doing music perception, they represent what? Going across the x-axis in music. Is that?
Oh, they're just different music conditions. It's like listening to orchestral music, listening to somebody playing a violin, listening to synthetic music. So they're just different kinds of music conditions. Yeah. So they're just different variants of these different kinds.
Like, because some of those bars look, for instance, as big as some of the bars in language.
No, they don't. These are the language bars. Are you talking about speech perception? That's not language.
That's
no.
speech. Okay, speech.
Yeah. Speech perception is just the acoustics of the signal, right? So it's like listening to speech in a foreign language. Yeah. Okay. So the task I want to tell you about that we just finished collecting data on is testing responses to inductive reasoning, which is kind of reasoning that is the core of all human learning about the world, right? We make observations and then we try to generate hypotheses about how those data came to be. So this is a program induction task that comes from George Tenenbaum's work. And the task is a very nice, simple task. You basically get an input and you're told what the output is. And I'm asking you to guess what rule generated that output, right? So if you see this one example, you may generate some hypotheses, like maybe, you know, take the less number or take the smaller number in the set or something like this, and maybe many, many other hypotheses, right? And then I say, okay, here is new input, and here is the new output, right? And oh, here's a new input, and you're like, well, maybe it's 7, right? You go with your last with your hypothesis, take the last number. And they say, no, the correct input is actually 2, 1. And then I give you the new input list, like 2, 7, 8, 4. And you're like trying some other hypothesis, right? Trying 2, 4. Like maybe anything smaller than 7 or something like that, right? And I'm like, no, that's still not right. And then you keep guessing until you get an insight. Maybe some of you, anybody knows what the rule is? Remove 7, exactly. So then you're like, oh, I'll try that, and that works. And then you do this a little bit more. And in the control condition, you're just told what the rule is, and you're applying it to the list. And so again, the gray bar is a response to language, and the little orange bars are the response during this task. So once again, the language system is silent while you're engaging in this kind of complex reasoning. Yeah.
Question: for all of these experiments, do you do it on an individual basis, or do you do it on the average language? So for all of these experiments, you're comparing language to the other tasks. You derive the individual's language first, and then
Yeah, that's like the whole foundation of my research program. So yeah, that's exactly right. You find it in each individual, and then you test, you know, for each of those conditions, you test like between, you know, 20 and sometimes a few hundred participants, depending on whether they're useful for other stuff too. But okay, so
average plus the entire language area.
that's right, but it's the same in an individual language area. Like there's 5 core regions, and they all look the same. So I'm just averaging across them. Thanks for these clarifications. Okay, so this complementary approach, which actually has been around for a long time, and we've had data for a long time, but somehow without the complementary fMRI data, these data haven't been perceived as having nailed that question. So the question is, can you think without language? And to ask that, you can look at individuals with severe linguistic deficits, right? So these are individuals with so-called global aphasia. So these are really, really severely impaired individuals. At best, they will have comprehension of like a handful of very high frequency words. They can't understand sentences. They can't produce anything. The language is gone. In fact, if you take one of their brains with this massive, it's typically a large stroke in the middle cerebral artery, which supplies this perisylvian language cortex. If you project our language system atlas into one of their brains, it basically is all like it projects into this hole, right? So that whole system is gone. And for a long time, language researchers have kind of ignored this particular population because the whole language is gone. So you can't really ask questions about language, right? Which is what a lot of language researchers are interested about. But for questions like, what can you still do if your language is gone? This population is a gold mine, right? And so you can say, okay, can these people still play chess or solve some math problems or engage, you know, in some kind of social reasoning? And it turns out, and Anya Ivanova, who is now faculty at Georgia Tech, has done a lot of this work. And Rosemary Varley has been testing these patients for many, many years now on diverse things. And basically, you find that anything but linguistic abilities are preserved in some of these patients. So you find these patients with severe, severe impairments, and you give them a non-linguistic task and they're fine. In fact, they love these tests because they've had years where they've been, you know, tested on various linguistic tests, and they're like, they fail this and they fail this. And then you give them like, you know, a chess problem, like if they're a former chess player, or some math, and they're like, yeah, I can do that, you know, and then they perform pretty much at the level of age match controls.
Yeah, a quick question someone asked online, but I think is related here is, do you do any of these tasks relate to imagined speech or language?
Yeah, so I mean, so it depends on what you mean by this. Covert speech, yeah, of course, if you engage in covert speech, as long as you activate the verbal representations, these regions are engaged. We have like one paper published on that, but yeah, it doesn't have to be like explicitly output or anything. And comprehension does this as well, of course, but yeah. Okay, so the only thing these patients lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format and to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. So empirically, it looks like language and thought draw on distinct resources, and even in the presence of severe language deficits, thinking and reasoning can remain intact. What about these other two questions? We recently, I'm not going to say too much about this. We just recently had a perspective paper on this come out. Why do we have language? Well, communication sure seems like a plausible function. It's surprising how controversial that's been in the field of language research, with some people explicitly denying communicative functions of language as anything very important. But there's now really like oodles of work showing that various properties of languages across the world seem to be optimized for efficient information transfer. And it's just not clear why that would be the case if you just use language for internal thinking, for internal cognition. And whether language made us smart, I don't think so. I think what language did is allowed for cross-generational transmission of acquired knowledge, so allowing us to build knowledge upon knowledge, which is what was pretty important to transform our species and the planet and build the civilizations we've managed to build. Okay, so the selectivity of the language system rolls out a whole bunch of hypotheses about what the system is doing. And that's a whole reason why, well, it's a big part of the reason why I was interested in looking at how these regions respond to these various other tasks, because it could inform the kinds of computations that are going on in the system. So, for example, we know that the reason that these language regions respond a lot to sentences, it's not because sentences are hierarchically structured, because many other inputs that are hierarchically structured, like math expressions or music, don't engage the system. We know it's not because sentences convey meaningful information, because again, pictures of meaningful events or videos that don't have language in them but convey meaningful information elicit a much lower response. It's not because sentences sometimes contain logical arguments or describe mental states, because non-linguistic stimuli with those properties don't elicit a response. And it's not because sentences are communicative signals, because facial expressions, gestures without accompanying speech elicit a very low response in the system. So let's take a deeper, so what the hell is the system doing then, right? So let's take a little deeper dive into this network. So what computations could it support? Well, just starting from like kind of first principles, like what do we do when we understand a sentence? Intuitively, we access meanings of the words, right? So we know what red-haired or woman means, and I'm showing them with pictures, but of course the meanings are more abstract, just for illustrative purposes. And you're then using your knowledge of the grammar to figure out how words go together, right? So you're figuring out that red-haired, it tells you something about woman, and with goes with her dog, and so on. And once you've put those two pieces together, accessing word meanings and figuring out the structure, you can access some kind of compositional meaning of the whole string. How exactly we retrieve word meanings and how we build these compositional representations remains a matter of active research, but a number of paradigms have been developed to engage these operations, which allow us to look for sensitivity to the cognitive demands associated with them in the brain. So I'll tell you one kind of the simplest paradigm that people have used to text word retrieval. You can compare the processing of real words, where we have to access word, we can access meanings from memory, and the processing of non-words, right, which are similar to words but don't map onto memory representations. And to text cognitive demands associated with constructing a sentence, you can compare responses to sentences versus a list of unconnected words, right? So only in sentences you're allowed, the stimulus allows you to engage in these combinatorial processes, putting this thing together. Some people have also tried to isolate kind of pure syntactic processing by using stimuli inspired by Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky poem. So you can create these kind of fake sentences where you take all the real words and replace them with non-words. It kind of also, so it looks like something like this. It's like sometimes you go, example I often give is like you go to a talk where you don't know the content domain, right? And it sounds like sentences, grammatical and everything, and you just can't understand what any of the words refer to, so you can't construct these complex meanings. So how do these different language regions respond to these different conditions? Well, here's one simple region. This is in a posterior temporal cortex. Sentences are the red bar, and so they include both word retrieval and sentence composition. Those stimuli elicit a strong response. The response is stronger than to a list of unconnected words, the pink bar, and words, unconnected list of words, elicit a stronger response than non-words. That's your light orange bar. So it looked like this language area is sensitive to both word retrieval demands and sentence structure building demands. Is it also sensitive to structure building when meaning cannot be easily inferred? Indeed, it is. This is the dark orange is the Jabberwocky sentence condition, which elicits a higher response than unconnected non-words. Oh, this is just very nice. One thing I've long wondered is whether the responses to typical sentences, so this bar versus this bar, is due to the fact that real words are the real stored basic units of language and kind of hold clues to how words combine together, or whether it's because the resulting meaning, which happens in sentences but not Jabberwocky, allows you to kind of make forward prediction about upcoming words. And so we just recently tested these sentences, which originally are due to, well, they're not actually originally due to Chomsky, but that's Chomsky's example, like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is a perfectly well-formed sentence made up of words, but the meaning doesn't really result into anything that we can meaningfully connect to our world knowledge. And it turns out that these sentences elicit as strong a response as real sentences. So in that sense, this language system is, you know, I don't want to call it dumb, like not to insult it or anything, but it's a pretty shallow, it's basically a parser system, right? It computes the structure and meaning of the sentence, but it doesn't do anything like interpret it with respect to our knowledge structures, abstract knowledge structures of the world. Oh, and I should say that other regions in the system look the same. When I first started looking at this paradigm, I was absolutely confident I will find like a syntax region and a word retrieval region, because that was my prior from my early undergraduate training, and that such a thing just doesn't exist. Anywhere you sample within the system, even with finer grain spatial approaches like intracranial recordings, you find that all populations show sensitivity to both individual words and combinatorial processing. And of course, this strong integration between words and structure makes sense given the highly contextualized nature of language, where interpretation of individual words is highly context dependent, and properties of particular words are very constraining with respect to how words combine with other words. So here's a tentative no answer for this question about different regions doing fundamentally different kinds of linguistic computations. Okay. So how do we do this sentence structure building? I'll just very briefly mention a couple of findings, just breathing through them. So there's basically two stories for what makes sentence structures harder or easier to build. One story has to do with memory demands, where this is a sentence I used before. I reworded it slightly to make this point, but basically, most connections in natural language are local between nearby words, but occasionally you have a so-called non-local dependency, right? A long-distance connection. And by the time you get to has in this case, it's been a while. So to connect it to woman, right, you've been processing this other stuff, and there's a measurable cost. You can measure it behaviorally with all sorts of approaches. There's a measurable cost that has, which presumably has to do with that extra memory demand. So that's one source of complexity. And another source of complexity is really at the forefront of a lot of discussions these days because of the success of large language models, and it has to do with processing unexpected information, right? So if the idea here is that comprehenders are actively predicting what's coming next, you may be guessing, you know, whatever dog or child, and then if you get giraffe, you're a little bit surprised. And there's, again, a measurable cost associated with unexpected elements. And behaviorally, it turns out that both of these factors explain some independent variance and like reading times and things like that. It doesn't seem like one of them can explain away the other. And so we've looked at this in the brain. This is work by Corey Shannon and Dan Blanc. And sorry, you can't see it's too small, but this basically, people listen to naturalistic stories and we code them for these two kinds of complexity of building structures. And we can find independent contributions, factoring out variance for surprisal. We find costs associated with working memory and vice versa. Now the baseline is not fixation. The baseline now is the average response to a word in a story. And these bars show the extra cost associated with making these non-local connections or processing these unexpected elements. So again, it seems like similar to what we find behaviorally, the system is sensitive to both of these kinds of costs of structure building. So integratory costs having to do with integration of information in memory and prediction. Okay, so maybe there's a stronger answer to this question of no. So I've now shown you these two kinds of effects very briefly, right? So one effect is a stronger response to structured compared to unstructured stimuli, like sentences versus a list of unconnected words. And another one is a stronger response to more difficult to process sentences. In a recent study, Greta Tuchkuta kind of showed both of these effects in one set of stimuli. for a reason I'll hopefully get to tell you a little bit later in the talk, she collected neural responses to 2006 word long sentences. So here you have a response to each individual sentence. And we can then collect acceptability judgments, like how good. Oh, and I should say that these sentences are, I'm putting them in scare quotes because they're sampled from the massive corpora that exist. And so sometimes they're not like perfectly well-formed sentences. They may be like a part of a caption of an image or something like that. I mean, they vary quite a lot in how good of a linguistic chunk they are. And we collect independent acceptability ratings on all of them. And then we can see how neural responses vary as a function of this acceptability ratings. And here's what we find. You can see it a little bit more clearly on the inset. There are error bars, but they're really tiny because there's a lot of items in each bucket. So what you find is that there is sentences that are strings that are not well formed are kind of similar to our word list condition from the earlier studies. It's kind of hard to make sense of them, and they elicit a relatively low response. Strings that are more well formed elicit a stronger response. So we're capturing this continuum from less well formed to more well formed linguistic inputs. But strings that are really well formed and very predictable and easy to process, again, elicit a relatively low response. So we're also capturing this climb from easy to process to harder to process inputs. Okay. Oh, and in this study, we can also make a stronger claim about the similarity among the different language regions, because we can say across, say, 2 regions, how similar are their preferences across these 2,000 sentences, right? If one region likes one sentence, will another region also like that sentence? And you find these very strong correlations suggesting that the preferences are quite uniform across the language system. So at this point, I would say that at the areal level, at the level of these regions, it's not that there is fundamentally clear dissociations about what these regions do during language processing. But there's at least two dimensions where we do find differences across these regions. And maybe I'll say this briefly, and I can come back and elaborate on it in the question periods if there is interest in this. But we've long known from the aphasia work, both classic and recent, that damage to posterior temporal language areas leads to longer lasting and more severe deficits. In fact, if you damage a language system anywhere else, within about a year, you recover quite well. If you have damage that spans these posterior temporal areas, you have longer lasting deficits. Here's just a quote from a modern day aphasiologist suggesting that this language may have a special status. Okay, but if that's really true, we should also find kind of some hints about the importance of this region in data from typical individuals. And indeed, we do. So remember how I said that there is a sensitivity to the complexity of linguistic materials with stronger responses to more complex stimuli. And we find this effect everywhere. So here's the just grouped into bins of 3 levels of difficulty: hard sentences, medium hard sentences, and easy sentences. And you find these effects everywhere else. But interestingly, in a lot of parts of the language system, the very easy sentences just don't elicit an above baseline response. So to process sentences like, whatever, can we go for a walk, or they had other things to do, you don't need to engage the frontal parts of your language system. You can process them focally within the temporal cortex. This is like the first time when we started unpacking these, looking at these short, easy sentences, is the first time where we don't see a response to language across this whole system. And another very different kind of data comes from polyglots. So we've done this work on polyglots and hyperpolyglots, so individuals who speak 5 for polyglots and hyperpolyglots 10 or more languages with quite some degree of fluency. And we reported this a few years ago, that polyglots seem to have small language systems. Okay, they don't activate as much of the language cortex, and the magnitude of response is lower. And we recently replicated this finding. And again, zooming into these different parts of the language system, we find that there's a substantial proportion of polyglots where the frontal regions just don't come online when they're processing their native language. They're just doing all of their processing within these posterior temporal areas. Okay, so complementing evidence from aphasia, it seems that the posterior temporal language areas are always engaged when we process language. We haven't found any conditions under which those regions don't come online, and they appear to be sufficient to process language, at least in some circumstances. Right, said that. Okay, And then I'll just say this finding. I'm not going to actually walk through the slides here because I want to talk about the LLMs. But there is also heterogeneity that we see in the system that doesn't correspond to these aerial groupings, right? So there's a lot of structure that we can see in this kind of salt and pepper pattern within each of these language regions, such that different neural populations do different things. So let me just, I'll bring up the reference and just say what the findings are. So this is a paper just came out based on data from intracranial recordings, where we looked at how much of the preceding context neural populations in the language system are sensitive to. So it's this notion of temporal receptive windows. For those of you who work on vision, it's basically the temporal analog of spatial receptive fields, right? So people like Uri Hassan have done a lot of work characterizing these across the brain. So we focused on the language areas. We'll use the localizer to find these neural populations in a bunch of people undergoing brain surgery. And then we did some simple modeling in the responses to sentences to see how much of the preceding context affects the processing of the current word. And we basically very consistently find that there's 3 different populations, very consistent, consistently responding in this way and varying across those populations, such that some populations track about 1 to 2 words, so very, very short things. Other populations track about 3 to 4 word long chunks, and yet others about 6 to 8 word long chunks. And that's about it. Like we know from additional studies that this system doesn't connect structure across discourses. So connecting between sentences is actually happening in a domain general system, which also connects information across longer across things and like nonverbal stimuli. Okay, yeah.
Spatial distribution.
They're really all over the place. I mean, there are some biases, some weak biases that we see for the smallest cluster to be closer to the posterior temporal cortex, but you also find some of those very clearly that live like in the frontal lobe as well. So it's not like spatially you see clear clustering. Of course, with a lot of intracranial recordings, you don't have uniform coverage, right? So you have already like biases embedded in that coverage, but you know, there's some weak hints that we discuss in this paper, but we don't make too much of the spatial stuff. Okay, so to wrap up this part, right, we find that this language system that's highly selective for language over many other things seems to support I mentioned this finding from different temporal receptive windows. There's also differences in semantic preferences and in how sensitive they are to surprisal in linguistic inputs. I don't have time to talk about this, but there's a lot of exciting work that we're now doing using these deep data approaches where we collect responses, you know, in a single individual to like thousands and thousands of linguistic stimuli to try to understand that organization in greater detail. So in the last few minutes, let me just say a few words about this work on large language models. So you guys could not have missed it. The world has been transformed in an amazing way by AI advances over the last just few years, where suddenly we have language models that are really, really, really good at language. This is, I mean, I know a lot of people here are young and you're like, well, maybe it's like, you know, matter of fact, okay, well, yeah, we have these models that the language was a big deal, but, you know, this is the first time in the history of humankind where we have something other than a human brain that can generate linguistic output, which is a thing that many, many, many people, including very famous people, said, well, it just can't happen. They said you can't learn language from statistical distributions of linguistic inputs. It's just impossible. It's only, there's a book by Chomsky and Burger called Why Only Us, where they make a very strong claim that it's only the human brain that's capable of this feat. Well, that's clearly wrong because there are these models, and even with like not that much training, they do pretty well in producing very grammatically formed coherent text. So that's pretty cool. And so me, along with many other language researchers, are really excited because suddenly we have a model organism. We never had a model organism, right? Because animal communication systems are really quite different from human language. No, it doesn't mean to be qualitatively different, but they're different enough so that it's hard to use them as model organisms. This is not a biological model. It's an in silico organism, but you can do a hell of a lot of cool stuff with it. Anyway, so yeah, models are good at language. They broadly resemble the language system, meaning that they show like sensitivity to both word meanings and abstract hierarchical rules, and no clear segregation between the units that do either one. So they're, and they, of course, rely on this next word prediction objective as the key training objective, which I think explains a lot of their success. And so inspired by these broad similarities, a few years ago, we asked, is it the case that these models also build similar representations when they process the same linguistic inputs? And this is an approach that was very successful in vision, showing that convolutional neural nets, which are neural network vision models, explain really well responses along the ventral visual stream. So the idea here, the approach is very simple. You take a stimulus, in this case, it's a sentence, say, and you feed it to a model and you feed it to the brain. From the model, you extract hidden unit activation weights from some layer. From the brain, you extract responses from the language areas recorded with fMRI or intracranially. And then using these two sets of numbers, you compute some similarity metric. And you can do it, there's two standard ways in which people do it. One is representational similarity analysis. One is a linear regression from activations to brain responses. Yeah, said that. Either of those gives you similar things. Oh yeah, responses here is just, you know, how strongly, for example, a neural population or a voxel responds to a sentence. So this is work that Martin Schremm did a few years ago, where we took off-the-shelf 40 off-the-shelf language models, and we tested them against several human data sets. So each bar on this plot will be a model, and similar models are grouped by colors. The vast majority of them are transformer models, which are like GPT-2 and its successors. And on the y-axis is basically how well each model can predict human neural responses in the language system for stimuli that have not been included in the training set, right? So generalizability to new stimuli. Right, said that. Okay, and here's what we find. The gray ceiling line here is based on an internal reliability of the data set. Just for context, in vision, that number is about like 0.7, 0.8. In language, it's much suckier. We've been trying to bring it up. We're now like 2.5. There are clever ways to do it, but there's one fundamental difference and challenge in getting reliable responses to particular stimuli in the domain of language, because you know, the ventral visual stream just does its thing, right? You show it an image and like 1,000th time you present it, it'll just do the same thing. For language, you can't present the same sentence 100 times and expect people to, you know, engage kind of with the process. You can, okay, yeah, I've seen this, and you just kind of give up. You get some benefit from repetition up to about 2 to 3 repetitions, and then it tempers off, but we're trying to find clever ways to elicit reliable responses by basically experimental cleverness. And I can tell you more what we're doing there. Anyway, in this effect, this match, so some of these transformer models in the GPT family do really well at explaining, you know, most of the explainable variants. And this effect has been now replicated by a few different groups. And then we've also asked things like, why are some models doing this better than others? We looked, for example, at how well these models do on the next word prediction task, right? And trying to rule out these kind of, you know, boring stories, like maybe just a bigger model will always do better, more parameters, you know, will do better. And size doesn't quite explain it all, but performance on the next word prediction task explains a lot of variance. Now each dot here is a model, and there's a strong relationship between how well you do on that objective function, training function, and how well you match the brain. And it's not true for other tests. You can see how well are these models doing on some other language tasks like grammaticality judgment, and that doesn't really bear that relationship. So it seems to be something special about this next word prediction task, which may be suggesting that optimizing for predictive representation is some kind of a shared critical objective for both biological and in silico models of language. If you're interested in this body of work, this is a review we've just put out focusing on this particular direction. I don't know, we've written a lot of reviews this last year. It just somehow has so happened it wasn't like a planned thing. And I'll just say a couple of other things why I'm so excited about these models. Like one thing that we just can't really study very easily in humans is language development. We don't have much control over the kind of input kids get. It's very hard to track. But with models, you can do these beautiful controlled rearing experiments where you control everything about what they get and see how their representations change as a function of these different factors. And then, yeah, doesn't really matter the details, but you can do cool things. You can build more developmentally plausible models and try to see if they capture responses better. But I'm also really excited about this right bottom corner where we're testing responses to particular linguistic stimuli over a developmental period, right, cross-sectionally. And then we're seeing whether models that are trained on different amounts and kinds of data are better able to recapitulate that trajectory in the representational space. We're also doing a lot of exciting things with non-invasive control. So this is a study, I'll just maybe say this last thing and then I'll wrap up. So this is a study that Greta Tuchkuta did, where basically we're trying to find the optimal stimulus for the language system. You may be familiar with the notion of supernormal stimuli. It comes from animal ethology work where little seagulls will peck more at a redder, right? You know how they peck at the little red spot on the mom's necks. So if you make that spot redder and give them like an artificial stimulus, they will peck even harder. So you can kind of optimize along the dimension that's relevant behaviorally. So this is kind of trying to bring that into the domain of language, where we measured responses to 1,000 sentences. So this is the ceiling, again, 0.34. And then we said, okay, now we have these massive corpora of language. Let's try to extrapolate. Let's try to stretch out these predictions and try to look for sentences that this mapping model predicts will elicit a really, really high response in the language system, or a really, really low response in the language system. So we call these drive and suppress sentences. And basically, and then we find these stimuli, and then we bring totally new participants, scan them on those new stimuli, and show that indeed you can drive and suppress activity in the system with these stimuli. This was just the very first step, kind of like a sanity check that this kind of approach can work. We're now applying this to try to dissociate different neural populations within the language system, right? So trying to optimize for particular features of stimuli using this empirical search approach, or creating stimuli actually using language models, because you can also do that. I'm gonna skip over this. So, okay, so this is, in the last 15 years, here's the things we learned. So the language system is distinct from other cognitive systems. The language areas respond only when produce and understand language, and are silent when we engage in many diverse non-linguistic tasks. The language system seems to support both computations related to word retrieval and sentence structure building. And for the latter, there is some evidence of both integratory and predictive processing. And although different regions in the language system are functionally similar, the posterior temporal one seems to be most important. And there is interesting functional heterogeneity at the finer grain spatial scale. And finally, representations extracted from large language models appear to be similar to those in the human language system, which I think makes them really exciting as candidate models for human language processing. And I'll stop here, and I'll just put up this slide of kind of where this is all going in case people want to talk about any of these other things. Thank you.